Welcome to Discovering the Motorcycle Seminars. My name is Armand, and today we will be presenting an AMA Vintage Motorcycle Days favorite, the first 100 years of motorcycling. Most of this information is available in great detail in my textbook, Discovering the Motorcycle. I hope you enjoy the ride. The first 100 years of motorcycling, Part 1. Looking for a convenient, effortless way to get around was always a desire people had. Horses were a good option. The only thing is that urban dwellers, in apartments especially, found it less convenient to own a horse, and the other problem was horses ate whether they produced work or not. The foundations, however, were there. This hobby horse shows that all it lacked was a motor, but it was convenient to take some of the weight off the legs. The solution was to add a motor to such a device, and this example of a 1903 Indian tri-car showed the direction that people were taking with personal mobility. First attempts, however, were quite a few years earlier. De Rivas in 1805 had a hydrogen-fueled carriage. You see the bladder containing the hydrogen, and he had a large piston about 8 inches in diameter and used a Volta ignition coil to create a spark to ignite the hydrogen. The problem with this device was that you couldn't hold enough hydrogen in a bladder. It did, however, prove that you could create a self-propelled vehicle. A more reliable source of power was the steam engine, first refined by Newcomen and then definitely advanced by Watt and his associate Boulton. The double-acting steam engine, which means the piston gets pressure, steam pressure from both directions, developed at the end of the 1700s, was rather large, 15, 20 feet tall for industrial models, and it was not until they were miniaturized that they would be adaptable. But Watt ran into a problem, and he had a difficult time explaining to people how the steam engine could replace their horses in running grist mills and power machine shops and so forth. People were concerned that the cost of the wood and coal used to fire the steam engines would be excessive. So he set out to determine and quantify the power of a horse. After long study, he determined that 1 horsepower is a horse's capability of lifting 33,000 pounds 1 foot in 1 minute. This is for sustained horsepower, as horses can reach over 14 horsepower during spurts of activity. By the way, 1 horsepower is about 746 watts. As a result, he was successful in proving that his steam engines were capable of producing the power at a lower cost than keeping a stable of horses. The proof of concept, a French fellow named Cugnot built a stream tractor in 1769. You can see the 2 cylinders on the top. The large device is a boiler, and this machine, which still exists at a museum in France, proved the concept that steam can be used for mobility. The device was rather unwieldy, and its maiden voyage resulted in a crash into a wall as depicted by this woodcut. But steam transportation became all the rage. Everything from fire engines to trolleys and buses were steam powered, as you can see in this Inshaw 1882 model. Steam required, though, that you have somebody tending to the boiler, and as you can see here, this fellow has to keep the coal and wood burning and the pressure up. Miniaturization started happening, and this fellow in Massachusetts named Sylvester Roper was really uh, pretty much in the forefront of it, creating miniature steam engines. You can see the chimney coming out of the bottom of this horseless carriage. And this was at the time of the Civil War. Roper was very successful with these small steam-powered carriages. A fellow named Lucius Copeland had great success in the late 1800s with this steam three-wheeler. It was all the rage. This is here in New York. But the first motorcycle that I genuinely feel was the first true motorcycle was Roper's personal steam velocipede. He started this in 1867 and had a really good working model by 1869. You can see that it's a wooden wheeled bicycle with a iron frame. We call these bone shakers because there was no suspension, and going over the rough cobblestones would have been really, a rattling experience, to say the least. Now, the boiler you can see hanging underneath the seat there held the firebox, which held a bucket of charcoal, and you can see the chimney coming out the top. The water reservoir was actually in the seat. Two small steam engines powered the rear wheel directly on their crank, and you can see that the crank also had rods that would activate the valves to direct the steam. This was a very effective device, and Roper would keep his charcoal bucket at full temperature whenever he went inside the office to work, and he'd simply come out, put the bucket in there, and the bike was ready to go. Because that's one of the problems with steam, was that it took a while to build a head of steam if you're starting from a cold boiler. Meanwhile, in Europe, a fellow named Perrault took a Michaud bike and added an alcohol fueled steam engine to it, and this also proved the concept. It worked very well. Copeland, the fellow with the three-wheeler, decided to build a steam engine onto a high-wheel bicycle, and it certainly functioned, but it didn't gain the popularity he had hoped. It was a little top-heavy and difficult to handle for the average person. Now, meanwhile, Roper continued developing his steam bicycle to a high degree and was determined to prove that it can go up to 30 miles an hour. And he went to Cambridge to run around a track with an audience of onlookers and students and prove that he could achieve 30 miles an hour. During his ecstasy of running the final lap, he suffered a heart attack and died, but he died doing what he loved to do, and that was to develop his motorcycle. Steam motorcycles evolved. In 1889, a German company, Hildebrandt, built this 1.5 horsepower steam engine powered bicycle, as you see on the left, and the British Pearson and Cox used kerosene to fire their two-boiler steam bike that produced a massive 3 horsepower. 3 horsepower was very common horsepower for even gasoline-engined motorcycles of that day. You can see behind the front wheel the fired tube boiler, the small tubes that would be heated by the kerosene flame. Now, meanwhile, the internal combustion engine was being developed at full pace. Now, internal combustion refers to the fact that the explosion that drives the piston happens inside the cylinder, whereby a steam engine is an external combustion device, whereby the heat and steam generated is outside of the piston, the cylinder. So internal combustion engines were well sought after for the fact that they could be fired up immediately rather than waiting for a head of steam to be developed. Now, Lenoir, French fellow, took a double-acting steam engine and converted it to a gas engine and proved that it can be very successful. This was a pretty large device, easily 8 to 10 feet long, and it was operated by gas. Now, when we say gas engine of the early days, we're talking about coal gas. Coal gas, when you heat up coal, it generates methane and a bunch of hydrocarbons, and it's very flammable. And it was used to illuminate homes and the street lamps. Therefore, they also call it illuminating gas. So the main source of these gas engines, the fuel, was coal gas. Mixed with air, maybe around a 7-to-1 ratio, produced the explosive material inside the engine that would be fired by a spark or a flame. And you can see underneath the device is the battery and the spark coils. And the bladder in the back on the wall is a rubber bladder used to regulate the gas pressure. The entire history of the engine is outlined in a chapter in the book called The History of the Engine. It goes into depth and shows all the different models during the evolution of the engine internal combustion development. Sugar Salesman brings it all together. A fellow named Nicholas Otto was a wannabe engineer, and he couldn't afford to go to technical school, so he studied everything he could. He sold housewares and sugar, and he ran into a fellow named Langen. And Langen was a trained engineer, and together they improved on the early internal combustion engines. But Otto was determined to create the highest efficiency internal combustion engine, which required a 4-stroke cycle. The 4 strokes of an internal combustion engine are the intake stroke, the compression stroke, the power stroke, and the exhaust stroke. Working on it successfully, here is a rare photograph of his 1876 working prototype. This is about the size of a desktop. And this engine here, which was buried in a farm field during World War II by the Germans for fear that the Allies would steal it, this engine is the DNA for which all subsequent 4-stroke engines are built. So your automobile engine is very much linked directly to this, and you can see the bevel drive camshaft, which rotates once for every 2 revolutions of the crank, is very much the same as it is today. Otto had a shop manager named Gottlieb Daimler working with him, and they soon butt heads because both were strong personalities. And Otto continued to pursue gas engine development, mostly for industrial applications. His company still exists today. It's called Deutz. And most of his machines were very large, anywhere from 6 to 10 feet long, and powered mills and machinery and so forth. Daimler set off on his own and built smaller engines with the hopes of creating horseless carriages and mobility devices. So he further developed his four-stroke Otto cycle design, um, had a cam-operated exhaust valve, atmospheric intake, and carburetor. See, so he was able to create a device that did not require a rubber hose with a gas line attached to it. His carburetor was able to use liquid fuel such as petroleum distillates, benzene, gasoline, and so forth to fuel his engine. Atmospheric intake means that the intake valve during the intake stroke is actually opened by atmospheric pressure when there's a vacuum inside the engine. So in order to prove his machine out and have a test bed, in 1885 he built the Reitwagen. Reitwagen means riding wagon, and he had really no intention of building motorcycles, but it turned out that he built the very first petrol-powered motorcycle. The original was unfortunately destroyed in a fire. It produced about a half a horsepower and ran at about 7 miles per hour. And it was a bone shaker, to say the least. No suspension, hard wooden wheels, but it proved the concept. So here is what it may have looked like in taking a ride on the Reitwagen. So you crank it up. Engine was probably around a little bigger than a 250cc single-cylinder engine. You now hop on and you tension the drive belt, and you'll see the pulley there, idler pulley, tensioning the drive belt. And this device actually was set up for 2 speeds. And you keep the throttle going, and the drive belt acts as the clutch, so you can control speed with that. And you can see that the bike is not very stable, but with the training wheels, it certainly keeps it on the road. Very impressive to say that this was back in the late 1800s. Here's a picture of Carl Benz, who worked independently of Daimler about 60 miles away. And Benz was focused on developing engines to adapt to carriages. And as a result, in 1886, Benz patented the first powered carriage and became the person to patent the first automobile. So technically this is the first automobile, and that credit goes to Carl Benz. Now Benz was to join Daimler later, as you well know, so now the company is known as Daimler-Benz, and both Daimler and Benz focused on developing automobiles right from the get-go. Now, meanwhile, back to motorcycles. Hildebrandt liked the idea of 4-stroke engines and joined with Wolfmueller to create a motorcycle, and this became the very first production motorcycle. What we mean by that is high volume production. They made as many as 2,000 of these. This was a 2-cylinder bike. You can see the cylinders on either side of the lower frame. They acted directly on the rear wheel, which acted like a flywheel. It was a solid casting. And the engine was water-cooled. You see the water tank up there in the down tube underneath the handlebars. And the fuel was stored in the rear fender. If you look carefully, you'll see 2 shackles, one near the connecting rod by the axle and the other one where the foot peg is. That held a large rubber band that helped the engine go through its cycle. This model was very successful, top speed of 28 miles an hour, and even saw its way to Japan, where it was studied for potential reproduction. Now, motorcycles were first seen and applied to pacing bikes. Bicycle racing was all the rage on large wooden velodromes. And motorcycles turned out to be a great way to establish the pace of bicycle racing, creating a draft to get a little higher speed for the racers. And people loved them because they were loud and noisy and smoky, and it was quite an attraction to see these on the tracks. Soon, the pacers themselves took to the tracks in between racing to have a little friendly competition, as you can see with this fella. And of course, eventually, the style for racing evolved. Lower handlebars to cheat the wind, faster engines, and more elegant designs. So the need for speed was, handled by making larger engines. Larger engines produce more power. Most of those early pacers produced anywhere from a half to 3 horsepower. But in as early as 1903, the French boys here built a 2.2 liter monster that was capable of a massive 22 horsepower, capable of approaching 60 miles an hour. So this bike ran a lot of races, especially long distance races like from Paris to Madrid. That was very popular back then. The road systems were very good in Europe. And the problem was that it didn't handle very well on the sharp turns, so the smaller bikes were able to outmaneuver it. But it showed that big horsepower can achieve some amazing results. But bigger wasn't always better. It got to the point where these bikes were weighing tons, and the cast iron cylinders were massive. They would get very hot. So there had to be a better solution, especially to create lighter machines that were more nimble on the track as well as the roads. And a French count named Albert de Dion, with his associate Bouton, took the opposite approach. They created smaller engines, like this 211cc little motor, that were designed to have lighter components, shorter connecting rods, and be able to spin faster to produce more horsepower. So you can produce horsepower by slow running engines with a lot of torque, or small engines with higher RPMs. And this little engine, compared to the 600 RPM monsters, were able to run as high as 1800 RPM. And you can see that this has a cam-activated exhaust valve that was connected by gears to the crankshaft. You can see that in the FN there. Even though this is a de Dion engine, this one is made by FN, a Belgian company. And the intake is by atmospheric valve, which means that as the piston comes down for the intake stroke, the low pressure inside the cylinder pushes the valve open through high pressure from the atmosphere. So think of it as sucking it open. Very, very effective little motors. De Dion built their own bike, a tricycle, that became all the rage all over Europe and licensed it throughout the world. So in the U.S., one of the licensees was Orient Company. And you can still see 1898 the Dion at the Motorcyclepedia Museum in Newburgh, New York, where it's the oldest running motorcycle in the United States. And they'll fire it up every once in a while. So this produced about 1 3/4 horsepower, which was plenty to drive, people around. And other applications soon developed. The Uber of its day, with a little cart drawn in the back for passengers. Now, meanwhile, while this is going on, the bicycle was not sitting still. The high wheelers had been replaced by safer bikes of wheels of equivalent diameter. Therefore, they called these safety bikes. The safety bicycles, which were really beginning to gain popularity in the late 1800s, combined with pneumatic tires to absorb some of the road shock, and drive chains, and like the Dion engines, created the perfect union to develop motorcycles. So you can see this, the Dion engine here fits very nicely into this loop frame bicycle, and the device right in the middle of the engine there, near the crankshaft, is the set of ignition points used for timing the spark, and the shaft going up to the gas tank is the device used to change the ignition timing, so you could start it with the engine retarded and advance the timing as it goes. This model used a atmospheric intake valve. You can see the top up there with the kind of a bell-shaped housing, and it used a cam-operated exhaust valve. Now, initially, a lot of these Dion engines, because they were so nice and small, were clipped onto bicycle frames, and people were building motorcycles out of their bicycles, as you can see in this model here. Motors were pretty much put on every component of a bicycle. There were motorcycles built with the engine on the front wheel. There were motorcycles built with the engine as the front wheel, sitting within and rotating. There were bikes built with the engine over the rear wheel, engine mounted, where the gas tank would be, and so forth. But in the early 1900s, a group of Russian brothers, two Russian brothers that were working in France, kind of defined the motorcycle the way it is today. So the Werner brothers placed their engine low in the frame for a nice low center of gravity. It can even be a stressed member of the frame, as you can see on this model. Gas tank up above it, hand controls on the handlebars or near the handlebars, and so forth. So this became the model to follow for motorcycle development. America's first manufacturer. Well, that's a little iffy, but a company called Steffi out of Philadelphia certainly was one of the first to actually make motorcycles by assembling various different manufacturers' components. They added engines to their frames and so forth. So the Steffi was very early in the game in American motorcycling. Now, meanwhile, bicycle racing was still going on at the velodromes, and there was one fellow named Oscar Hedstrom who was very good at building very small, nimble pacers. This is a tandem pacer, And it caught the eye of a fellow named George Hendy, who was a former bicycle racer and had a very, very successful bicycle manufacturing factory in Springfield, Massachusetts. Hendy, on the left here, uh, contracted Oscar Hedstrom and partnered with him to build a motorized bicycle, which ended up becoming the Indian motorcycle, and it first was sold in 1901. Uh, George Hendy had used Native American references to his bicycles, and therefore the Indian name was a natural for him for his motorcycles. A true cottage industry developed. Many enterprising people who had a small shop were able to either build or adapt engines to their bicycle frames, and one such group was Harley and Davidson, who built their own bicycle frames and adapted their own de Dion style small engines to those frames. So many companies like Pope and Yale and Flying Merkle used the same de Dion style technology to power their machines. Harley's belt drive has a long history. Harley-Davidson likes to power its motorcycles' rear wheels with Kevlar cog belts nowadays. Very, very reliable. And in the early days, they used leather belts. The tension on the leather belt was increased by the lever, by the gas tank you see, and that pushes that idler wheel, the idler pulley there, tight, and that's how you controlled the power to the rear wheel. It was like a clutch. The only problem with these leather belt drive engines was in extreme wet weather, they would tend to slip a little bit, and you'd need to push them off. But it was very, very common for motorcycles to be leather belt powered. You can see in this Flanders here, built around Pittsburgh, I believe. This has a belt drive. You see the idler pulley down below the engine there and the lever, but it has a second lever, and that lever was a clutch mechanism that would allow the idler pulley to remain in tension but disengage the crankshaft from affecting the drive pulley. So you could actually keep the motor running without loosening up your drive belt. So this allowed you to come to a stop, keep the motor running, and then simply use the clutch lever to gently accelerate forward. So it was a big advancement. The other thing you see is on the front, you see a spring on the front suspension, so things are a little more comfortable. The U.S. Motorcycle makers love the idea of their rigid rear frames, so even though they had front suspensions, they didn't have rear suspensions for quite a while. Indian actually had leaf spring suspension a decade later, and that worked pretty well. The other thing you'll notice is that a lot of these bikes did not have a front brake. Most American manufacturers didn't put a front brake on the motorcycles. They kept sort of a bicycle coaster brake in the back. A lot of the reasoning for that was the American roads system were not as refined as Europe's. There was a lot of dirt and gravel roads, and front brakes often caused folks to lock up the front wheel, fall over. That was at least the public reasoning why front brakes weren't really necessary. And anybody who rides knows that using a front brake on gravel roads or going down a hill is not recommended. So Indian, for example, it wasn't until 1928 when their bikes became fast enough and powerful enough and the road systems allowed for higher speeds that it actually added a front brake. That's quite a while. Now, the first Indian was very stylish. It was a brilliant, engineering feat by Hedstrom. They call these camelback models because of the gas tank on the back fender. It used a single cylinder. Remarkably, the engine was, first of all, it was a Dion type engine, but it looked remarkably like a patented model in the US by a fellow named Heffelfinger that actually patented his a few months before Hedstrom built his Indian. But whatever, it became very, very popular. It was used by police departments to replace horses. It was chain driven, and it took dry cell batteries to fire up the ignition system. And examples of this can be seen again at the Motorcyclopedia Museum in Newburgh, where they have one of every year Indian ever built. So it's quite a timeline to go and see. As we said before, by the first decade of 1900s, over 100 makers in the U.S. were making motorcycles or motorcycle-related equipment. Up top is a two-cylinder, twin-cylinder Yale. On the left, you have Marsh. You have Reading Standard on the lower right. And Sears, of course, kept motorcycles in their catalog right through the 60s. They, bought them from various manufacturers and simply branded them as Sears or later on Allstate. And of course, just as many in Europe. The BSA on the upper left there. You can see the rim on the front and rear wheel. That's called a rim brake, where a rubber block would rub against that to be used as a brake. So they had a front brake on that 1924 BSA there. And there's a Sunbeam on the right and a 1910 Belgian FN four-cylinder with shaft drive on the bottom. Total loss. The Dion engines did not have a separate oil reservoir or circulating oil. You basically put in, a half a pint or more of oil in the crankcase, and the oil would slosh around and lubricate the internal parts. And when you ran out of oil, the engine would slow down and overheat and seize up. So you needed to keep an eye on it and go by feel as to, when you need to replenish the oil. So most of the bikes back then had an external oil pump, as you can see on this Harley Racer, that as you're riding it and you feel the motor slowing down a bit from overheating, you just pump in a few extra squirts of oil into the crankcase. Indian dominated the first 14 years of American motorcycle building. It became the largest manufacturer in the world. It produced as many as 32,000 bikes in 1913. And it actually introduced an electric start bike with a Hendy, called the Hendy Special in 1914. Unfortunately, it wasn't very successful because the batteries weren't reliable enough. But perhaps only one, maybe two, there's only one that I know of, example exists of a original Hendy Special, and that was actually found relatively recently in a basement someplace where somebody had saved their money and bought one back in those days and never picked it up. But they're priceless now. The others, people simply converted them back to their pedal start or kick start, and it's one of those things that it didn't require a battery to start. Now, these early bikes, you notice, did have pedals because they could be used as bicycles, but the pedals were primarily designed to start the engine. So you put the bike on a rear stand uh, and start pedaling and get the motor going. You could certainly also start them by just pedaling down a road, but pedaling with the stand up made it a little easier, especially with the larger two-cylinder V-twin engines. So Harley-Davidson endured through better management decisions. Indian got so big that it lost its focus on motorcycle development exclusively. It got involved in making outboard motors, refrigerators, airplanes, and even automobiles. And meanwhile, Harley stayed true to its mission of making motorcycles. It managed its government contracts better during the First World War, and as a result, Harley developed a loyal following as being a very reliable motorcycle. Now, racing sells motorcycles, and the bicycle velodromes were soon replaced by large motordromes. A couple of them in the U.S. were 2 miles in diameter. If you can imagine the amount of 2x4s it took to build that, it's massive. But they were spectacles that generated a lot of income, and there were, several large venues, over a dozen of them, that held regular races. And the kids that would race on these things were basically taking bicycle-sized machines capable of going over 90 miles an hour with not much safety equipment. And you can see the steep banking here on these motordromes. Unfortunately, between the number of drivers that were killed and spectators from bikes flying over the edge, this racing venue was disbanded. So by the second decade of the 1900s, they fell out of favor. But it was very lucrative. A young fellow like this could make $2,000 a year, where the average American back then was lucky to make $500 a year. But racing was still something that fascinated the public. So one fellow named Irwin Baker was well known for his endurance run on his Indians. He would drive from San Francisco to New York, pretty much 18 hours a day, and he did it in around 11 days. And one would say, well, that's a long time. Well, when you think about the fact that most of the ride was on roads that you're looking at in this picture, because there was no highway system at that time, it was quite a feat. So Irwin became known as Cannonball Baker, and to this day, there's a cannonball run in the United States whereby a couple of dozen fellows and gals with antique motorcycles will drive across the United States and see if their bikes can make it, and they call it the Cannonball Run. Glenn Curtis was focused on airplanes. He was competing with the Wright brothers, and he built his own engines, and very good engines, and he decided to take the Dion concept to a high level by making an 8-cylinder V8 Dion style engine, atmospheric intakes type engine. And in order to test out the engine, sort of like Daimler did, he put it on a custom-built motorcycle, and he was able to achieve 137 miles an hour in 1907. I mean, that's a huge amount of speed back then, a record that wasn't broken for decades. And this proved the concept of the power and capability of that engine that he later on applied to his airplanes. Uh, this example is at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. There's one in Hammondsport, New York, and it's remarkable to see. The bike is there for exhibit as well as various engines. Now, meanwhile, in Europe, people were racing motorcycles all over the place. Paris to Madrid was a really good high-speed course, and millions of people would line the streets and cheer the riders on. But in England, because of the strong lobbying of the railroad industry, uh, laws were passed that limited vehicle speeds of 20 miles an hour on public roads, and there were really no racetracks. There was one racetrack that was built, but it didn't serve the needs of a lot of highly competitive racers. So the British racing groups, called the Autocycle Union, was welcomed to a small island in between Ireland and England called the Isle of Man, which was a crown protectorate, but it was its own little island. And the Isle of Man welcomed the racers and said, you know what, we'll let you race on our public roads. And as a result, in 1907, they held their first race on a 15-mile stretch of road. And the first race was won on a Norton. And you can see James Lansdowne Norton there. The frame and basic structure of the bike was designed by Norton. The engine was a Peugeot, though. But this started the ball rolling. So the Isle of Man, by 1911, expanded itself to a 37.75-mile course throughout the towns and villages and the mountain roads. And to this day, the Isle of Man remains one of the most noted and demanding and prestigious motorcycle venues, racing venues out there. This is in 1950 with Jeff Duke and the Norton featherbed, which meant that the rear suspension was nice and soft. Were pretty much always taking the lead. Norton was very, very dominant manufacturer in racing back then. And the TT continues to be the racing venue, the greatest racing venue today for both gasoline-powered engines and electric powered motorcycles. Now, the modern races are in late May, early June, typically for a couple of weeks, and then in September for vintage enthusiasts, there's vintage racing where they race anything from 100-year-old bikes to bikes built in the 1950s, and it's certainly a sight to see. Very festive, beautiful island. Now, meanwhile, motorcycles were the most popular means of personal transportation in the early 1900s. People could afford them. People could not afford large automobiles, which at that time were pretty much hand-assembled. Many of them were one-offs and would cost anywhere from $1,500 to $3,000, where the average income was $300 to $500 a year. So it was very, very difficult for the average person to afford an automobile. But motorcycles certainly solved that problem. So for family mobility, the motorcycle with a sidecar was a solution, as you can see in this picture of this. And of course, in the United States, Harley and Indian motorcycles with sidecar were a primary means of transportation for not only personal, family, but also for supplies and groceries and lumber, whatever you needed. And it was a hardy bunch of folks because, you know, they would run these machines all seasons, you know, whether it be in the snow. And the nice thing about the sidecar is that it allowed a level of stability in wet or slippery conditions that a motorcycle with two wheels did not. The other thing is, sociologically, motorcycles greatly expanded opportunities for employment. They were relatively cheap to keep, got good mileage, and allowed people to seek employment, you know, at greater distances. So this changed the dynamic of the American workforce. Also, it encouraged adventure. As early as 1913, Carl Clancy drove his Henderson, four-cylinder Henderson, around the world. He was the first of hundreds that would follow him. And you need to remember that this was at a time where dirt roads, mud and sand and all that were the predominant roadways of the day throughout the world. And those riding around the world in fancy BMW R1200s and GS 1200s and so forth, you know, really had nothing on these guys. You know, these guys were the real heroes that were able to do that with machinery like this that wasn't really built for off-road use. And then came the 1914 Model T. This was the first big disruption to the motorcycle industry. Henry Ford's Model T was the first real assembly line production vehicle. It started in 1908. Tens of millions were produced, and it was the VW of its day. And by 1914, a base Model T selling for under $300 actually was cheaper to purchase than, let's say, an Indian with a sidecar that was a little bit over $300, about $360 fully loaded. So it made no sense for family members to cram themselves into a sidecar out in the open weather and on three wheels when you had the opportunity for a semi-enclosed stable vehicle with four wheels and other models, of course, for a few extra dollars. For an extra $50 you could get a four-door. And so this is what killed the motorcycle industry and created a lot of shutdowns by the smaller manufacturers. So by this time, the big ones, Indian, Harley-Davidson, Excelsior, Reading Standard, and several others, Henderson, survived, but only because of their large manufacturing capability. The small ones just fell off and were lost to history. So we'll stop here for part one. Part two, we will continue.